Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students, and today I'm really happy to have with me here today Pippa Norris from Harvard University.
Pleasure to be here. Nice to see things.
You're here today to discuss the topic tipping points, cultural backlash and rising populism. What was your presentation about today?
So there's a lot of concern about the rise of populist parties. We can think about Trump in America or Brexit in Britain, but it's a universal phenomenon. It's been going on particularly in many established democracies in Europe, as we know, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in France. And really it's a puzzle which is challenging a lot of political science to understand what the explanations are and what the consequences are going to be as well.
So what are the explanations that you have been offering?
So there's two main arguments going on. One is about economics, and you've heard it before. It's about the left behinds, those who are less well off, who've had relative deprivation, or have low wages, or low skills, or low security. That's often the case. And it's argued that certain communities which have seen industrial decline are particularly those who will be appealing to Le Pen and Haider and all the others. The other argument, however, is cultural backlash, and this is the one we find more persuasive. And the economics seem pretty interesting in terms of the economic crisis of 2007-8. So we thought, well, if economy is going down, that's a natural way. If people don't think the mainstream parties can handle the economy, they'll go to other parties. But what we see very much now is that it's much more of a long-term phenomena. And again, it's not just in those countries that went down, like, for example, Spain or Italy or Greece. It's also there in affluent countries like like Sweden or Finland or countries like Denmark. So cultural backlash is the better explanation, we think.
Okay, and you have been basically in recent years working on a huge data set that looks at a lot of variables. Can you maybe explain us a bit, like what are the variables that you have looked at? What were also other explanations that you were looking for but maybe did not discover, and what were the surprises?
So the first thing we have to do is think, how do we classify authoritarian and populist parties? And that means what we're using is expert data. And there's two sources for that. One is the Manifesto group, who look at all the party platforms, but they're pretty bad at actually measuring populism. Instead, they're kind of fixed. They're looking at left-right issues, the market versus the state. So what we first used was CHES, it's known as, which is the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. They ask experts in each society to take their parties and to classify them on a range of different dimensions on scales. And we were able to use those scales to measure basically their support for authoritarian versus libertarian values. Things like, are you anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant? Are you in favour of cosmopolitanism or nationalism? Are you in favour of new forms of diversity or against? And then we had a couple of measures there of populism as well. So we were able to classify, for example, whether parties were anti-corruption and anti-establishment. So then we got a map, and we got all the parties in Europe, and we were able to classify where they were. And we divided them into two cleavages. One is pluralist, one is populist, one is libertarian, and one is authoritarian. Then the next puzzle, of course, once you've done that, is then to say, how do voters support them? So we use the European Social Survey, which is a wonderful resource. It's done in every European country every 2 years. And so if you pool the data, you get a tremendous variation. And you can look at those who supported the parties which were classified by CHES by their socioeconomic background, demographics, cultural values, political attitudes, etc., etc. And the bottom line is that essentially the economic factors didn't really explain support. So you could look at their income, you could look at their social class, and you could look at whether they felt worse off than their parents. That's kind of social deprivation, right? None of those really predicted whether they would consistently, across Europe, vote for authoritarian populist parties. But we could also measure what you might term authoritarian values. And here what we have is a little technical. It's known as the Schwartz scale, after Shalom Schwartz in Israel. He doesn't ask directly about policies, because that would be a bit obvious. So he doesn't ask people, for example, are you against immigrants, or are you for NAFTA or for UN? What he asks them is about your personal values. What's most important to you? And he says things like, here's a person, and this person thinks it's really important to be obedient to authorities and to obey the law. Is that like you or not? And somebody else says, well, here's a person who thinks it's really important to have a strong government that's going to protect us against any threats. You can create a nice authoritarian values scale. We found that was the thing which was really predicting support, along with generation, because the young were much more libertarian than their parents, and education. That was important as well. And to some extent race, although ethnicity in Europe is very complex. It's easier to classify in some ways in the United States. But those are the factors, generational divides on those authoritarian values that really predicted party support.
That is interesting, but you have also not only looked at Europe, I mean, of course, in this study, but also at other countries. Do those results go along with the findings from, for example, the US that you have been finding before?
That's right. So the European Social Survey does cover Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, so it covers Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. So that's a wide variety of countries. Then we also did case studies of the United States based on the American National Election Study and also Brexit based on the British Election Study. And again, those are great cases to look at. Brexit because we have actually the dynamics from the 2015 general election, the referendum 2016, 2017 general election, and we can see therefore how the party's support changed, how the party positions shifted, and how the voters shifted. And again, it seems a consistent pattern. Generational cleavages were enormous. It's the biggest it's ever been in Britain in terms of whether they wanted to stay in Europe or whether they wanted to leave Europe. And we could also see that there were big divisions by education. Graduates wanted to stay. Those who were less educated did not. And then by values. And again, just to emphasise, it's not simply anti-immigrant. That's a part of it. But it's a broader sense of nationalism, and it's a broader sense of being against big cultural changes going on in society. Those are the things which are much more subtle, but help to predict. And we also did a case study on Trump, and we looked at the American National Election Study, and again, it was a similar story. But again, a fascinating case where the parties have shifted, the parties have become divided, but what seems to occur is that these cultural values, when articulated through particular leaders or parties, resonate with a group of the public that otherwise felt disenfranchised or they weren't represented, and they've been able to maximise that support.
What I find interesting about this is basically that I think most of us have an idea of what democratic or liberal values are or might be, but what exactly can I imagine under authoritarian values if it's not about issues as immigration, as you said?
So we don't want to ask about issues because that has problems of endogeneity. In other words, it's circular. I could support, for example, Le Pen because I'm anti-immigrant. I don't want to have as many Tunisians, Algerians or other refugees. Or it could be because I'm against those minorities that I therefore support Le Pen. So what you're looking for is something which is a bit more independent. And that's why the idea of authoritarian values, which goes right back to the authoritarian personality, which emerged after the Second World War, but has been updated in how we can measure it and think about it, is a really good way of trying to get at these sorts of issues. And you can see that in the rhetoric, certainly of Donald Trump, but also of many other leaders, these are the themes again which emerge all the time. That basically Donald Trump is an appeal to a nostalgic America where he's both xenophobic in terms of other countries, but he's also attacking many other groups who are changing and challenging social conservatism. Even though personally you might not have thought that, in terms of what he stands for, what he articulates, what his arguments are, they're very much an appeal to mainstream America that wants to return to a kind of white picket fence, nostalgic sense of what America was 30, 40, 50 years ago, before the diversity of culture and the diversity of peoples as well.
So are those politicians authoritarians, or?
Yes. They're authoritarians, again, if we look at their actions once they get into power. So when there's always been these sorts of parties around, but they were very marginal. In the 60s and 70s, they were 5%, 6% across Europe. What's been happening is, as they have grown, particularly, they had a big spurt in the 1980s. It isn't the most recent phenomenon, but they've gained in seats, they've gained, therefore, a platform, they've gained in visibility, they've gained ministerial office, and, of course, increasingly government office as well. And sometimes their policies have been absorbed by the mainstream parties. UKIP went down, largely because the anti-European Brexit means Brexit, so the Conservatives took those policies on. So these parties have gained in power. And what you can see, particularly in the countries which have only really recently emerged as democracies, the Hungaries, the Polands, the Czech Republics, the Venezuelas, the Philippines, the Turkeys of the world, there what you can see is tremendous cutback, particularly on the liberal side of democracy. So it's freedom of the press, which has been systematically undermined, not just by claims of fake news, but in many cases by the arrests of journalists or intimidation or harassment. Intimidation against academics to be able to speak out. Lack of freedom of expression. Changes to make sure also, for example, in Hungary, that Viktor Orban's party, through the electoral system, manages to reinforce its power and create a more majoritarian system. So, particularly in the United States, you might have thought that liberal democracy is so strong that Donald Trump couldn't necessarily displace it or challenge it. But increasingly we see that many of the institutions we had hoped would provide a check and balance on the executive just proved very weak. And that's particularly the case in Congress. Again, in 2016, when he was elected, everybody said, that's okay, the GOP has got adults, they'll stand up for the things which are traditional Republican policies. They haven't, they've just curtailed. Many of the more moderates have left. And if we look at other institutions, the courts have been incredibly effective, but they've had limits. And again, with the Supreme Court changing hands and 2 appointments, that's going to skew it systematically, and particularly on things like voting rights, gerrymandering decisions that have come up. Those certainly do not look very progressive decisions. And then on other issues as well, a lack of tolerance, social tolerance, a lack of a bitterness in politics, a way in which people can't even talk to each other now, is really undermining the civic norms, the democratic norms beyond the law, which allows us to actually work and to trust each other in politics, to bargain, compromise, and do all the other things.
Mm-hmm. I've recognized that you actually use 2 terms that, where other authors and other scholars decided to use other terms as well. So you're using the term backlash, and other scholars are talking a lot about deconsolidation of democracy, and then you talk about authoritarianism and sort of illiberalism. Can you give us an insight about why you choose to use these terms?
Everybody uses different theoretical concepts and structures and things like that. The consolidation literature was one that was very strong in the 70s and 80s. It was where we were trying to explain why countries that had had a transition from authoritarianism were creating institutions that would then become democratic norms, and that works. Deconsolidation, I don't think, is really what it's about. Again, think about the United States. You're not talking about deconsolidation. The country's been democratic for centuries, but we're talking about certain threats or norms. And to call something a negative of liberalism, I don't think is very helpful, because it is, I think the word authoritarian is much stronger than the word illiberal. Illiberal simply says it's an absence of something. Authoritarian says, no, it's a set of values which are different, which have been out of fashion in many ways in Western democracies, certainly for a long time, but actually stand for something. So it's, if you like, it's thinking, again, about when we're classifying regimes. People talk about, we have democracies, we have semi-democracies, we have non-democracies. I'm sorry, authoritarian regimes are very different, and we need to work out what's the difference between, for example, a theocracy like in Iran, a monarchy like in Saudi Arabia, a military regime like in Burma or Myanmar, one-person rule, a one-party rule, and by always talking about the negative of the West, where it's a very lazy kind of shortcut. We know what democracy is, so we think they're not democracy. Well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. We have to work out what they stand for and what the values are, and what's driving support for these types of regimes.
Mm-hmm. What is driving the force of these regimes?
Well, for us, it's the cultural argument about the values. So people basically are feeling under threat. They're feeling that the things which are familiar around them, the traditional values that they think are important, have been being eroded by the forces of quote-unquote modernity, you can call it, but we can call it a variety of other, in other words, the rise of social liberalism. And this is a trend, again, from the 70s onwards that we've been able to document. So certain values are shifting. Think about, for example, religion, the rise of secularization. People are no longer going to church, they're no longer thinking that religion is important to their lives. So that's a big threat to everybody who believes in traditional religious values, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian. Similarly, changes in marriage and the family, an enormous shock. Changes in how far we see ourselves as part of a nation state versus part of a cosmopolitan, broader world. Are you European? Are you German? Are you Swedish? Are you British? So these changes are they're like seismic changes in society due to social forces, and one group has been benefiting, the young, the educated, those who are liberals, those who are on the east and west coast in America. Other groups are losing out in their cultural predominance. They were the majority group, they now no longer are, but here's the twist. They're becoming a minority in the population, but still a majority of the electorate because they vote. So there's an imbalance, there's a representation gap between the value change and the political representation.
Mm-hmm. And coming back again to my point about liberalism, Viktor Orban himself announced his government actually to follow the model of illiberal democracy. So following your argument, framing it this way of how Hungary is making its policy is basically a way to cover up authoritarianism, or? Well,
I mean, every single word is value loaded, so none of these are neutral, and everybody is going to try and use them in different ways. So it's politics, basically, language of the politics. But I think that authoritarianism is a longer tradition. After all, illiberalism really took off with Zachary Faria in the period of the 1990s, and authoritarianism goes right back. And it's better than the word fascism, it's better than the word authoritarianism, or dictatorship or tyranny. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different related terms. But again, I think we need to kind of get to grips with the variety. Just like we have democracies, we don't just talk about democracy, we understand, for example, majoritarian or consociational, very different types. Social democracy and liberal democracy are very different types. So we need to understand authoritarianism. Has a long pedigree, so it's worthwhile using, but it has a variety of different groups and ways of having institutional exemplifications.
Mm-hmm. You are talking about basically two different stages in the process as well. You have tipping points involved and you have the backlash involved. How exactly do those two features interact with each other?
So a backlash is a long-term process, and we're talking about changes from the 70s, 80s, 90s as social liberalism took off. Things like attitudes towards gay rights and homosexualities, attitudes towards divorce, attitudes towards women's roles, attitudes towards women in the workforce and in power. All of those are long-term shifts that you can document quite nicely. And then at a certain stage, the idea of a tipping point is that you reach a change in the majority population. And so those values, which always were a minority but were confined to the student generation, have gone mainstream, just like protests have gone mainstream. And then at a certain point, they become the majority. And when they become the majority, especially in a system like in the UK or US, which is a majoritarian electoral system, that means they gain power if they participate. And then, of course, the parties have to respond, because then they know that's where their vote comes from. The idea of a tipping point is a more dramatic exemplification. It's kind of wave theory. And I think it's important because, again, sociologists often think in terms of long-term secular changes, which are important, but the idea of a dramatic shift, and again, Trump, I think, exemplifies that. Nobody in 2015 would have predicted a Donald Trump, despite the fact that the trends were there, the tea leaves were kind of, it's certainly in the GOP party, were certainly pointing in that direction. But he comes in, by accident, more or less, he got through in the electoral college, because of course he didn't win the popular vote. But once he wins the White House, then he starts to institute changes which are decisive and which are going to be very difficult to reverse. And it's not just the Supreme Court that would be very difficult to reverse if it goes further towards the right, but also other changes in social tolerance and feelings of trust, confidence and attitudes towards migrants and immigration. Certainly in terms of international relations, he's destroying a lot of the trust which is the basis of the G7 or the Paris Climate Accord or NATO. So he doesn't necessarily need to legislate, and indeed he hasn't been very successful at that. He doesn't need to institute these things, but they still get embedded in the social norms. If he treats, for example, the authoritarian strongman leaders around the world as equals, as he seems to do, but he basically is very critical of Angela Merkel or Theresa May or Macron or even Justin Trudeau, then you're destroying a certain relationship between countries that took decades to build up.
We have actually two comments that came in right now, and Hussein says hi from Baghdad, and we say hello back. And Max is asking the question, on the basis of your research, do you see a relationship between the level of support for authoritarian values and the quality of education for human rights and democratic citizenship? Quality of education here can be understood through, for instance, the significance attributed to this education from the primary school level or the way how it taught and presented across various school subjects. If so, and assuming this relationship is inverse, what requirements does it set for education policy development?
So most of the values of the socially liberal are very strongly predicted by education, as you would expect. And so those who are less educated feel threats. And one of the interesting things, by the way, is we don't know why that relationship works. We think probably, if you go along with Russell Harding, that trust and these attitudes are really about information. The more you have information about other countries, the more you tend to trust them. The more you have information about your politicians, how the process works, the more you tend to trust it. If you don't have any information, you're not educated, you don't have the knowledge, then the default characteristic is not to trust it, right? So education is systematically linked to all of these big value changes in society, and the incredible growth in the number of graduates, especially amongst women, but in general in Western societies and in developing societies as well, has transformed our values. On the other hand, the problem is also that what we can think about in terms of the role of education for dealing with these challenges from populist leaders and authoritarian forces and so on. And there it's difficult to see. It's not so much that it's civic education which matters, it's more just the general process of education. And again, student leaders have always been at the forefront of these kind of social movements and environmental movements, movements for inclusion, movements for human rights, which is great. And that's going to continue, by the way, as well. But there's going to be more of a pushback from those who feel that they haven't benefited, called the left behind by some. But I think it's just fairer to say the older generation who feels that their values are not being reflected in the new culture.
Mm-hmm. Talking about education, I think it might also be relevant for us to point towards academia, basically, and talk about responsibility of academia. You're researching on populism for a long time. How do you yourself position yourself in your research when you research on populism? What is the responsibility of research here?
So I think it's a little difficult on this issue. On lots of issues I've covered, I've done research on issues of, say, the internet or on religion or on gender equality and so on. I've always been I'm at the Kennedy School of Government, which means we're very much concerned with policy and a public affairs audience as well as an academic audience. So we always try to write in a very open manner, which is not so much for academic journals, which are much more technical, but good monograph research books, if you like, for university presses, which are really accessible. Simple things like, how do you put your statistical information over? Do you put it over in a very complicated table with a lot of footnotes, or do you try always to visualize it so somebody can see what the results are, even if they don't understand what's going on behind the numbers and so on? So part of it, I've always seen a duty to have a public affairs audience, and the Kennedy School does as well. They've always prioritised that. But on this particular topic, it's also difficult because I feel just very personally involved in it, much more so than many of the other issues. And it affects me because I used to be British, I still have a British passport, and Brexit disrupted all of that, and right now Britain is all over the place in its politics, hasn't a clue what's going to happen in its future. Nobody can predict. And then it happened in America as well, and then it happened in many other places around the world. And it really feels like a threat to all the things which I hold valuable, whether it's cosmopolitanism in terms of nationalism, or whether it's in terms of gender equality, or whether it's in terms of environmental protection, or whether it's in terms of progressive policies more generally. I mean, everything which I stand for in my personal values are under threat by these particular developments in these countries. So I'm not particularly neutral when I'm talking about this. I have my evidence, I have my science, and I'm certainly objective when I look at, is it this explanation or that explanation? But I think we have a duty to talk truth to power and to actually try to get the message out. This book, by the way, which I've done with Ron Inglehart, started as an op-ed in the Washington Post. It started in March 2016. And it was when Trump was just getting through in some of the primaries. And I said, which I thought was obvious, Trump is actually an exemplification of what's going on in Europe. And I was amazed by the number of Americans who hadn't realised that, and the number of people who thought that was a really valuable connection. That then led to an IAPSS paper in Poznan and an APSS paper, which again just kind of fleshed these things out. That has now been, I believe, downloaded record numbers of times. It's in the top 10. Over 50,000 people have looked at it. It's got already lots of citations. And then the book. So all of these things, it started with a simple blog, which, because of the interest in the blog, made me feel that I had to write it up more and get more evidence and get more data. And then the book itself was difficult to write, partly because events were unfolding. And so as soon as you wrote about, Madison at the State Department, then he got fired, etc., etc. So you want to be topical and you want to catch what's happening, but of course it's a moving goalpost because Trump was evolving and Brexit was evolving and populism was changing in France with the elections, in Italy, in Germany. So we've tried to capture it with solid evidence, but also reflecting very much politics and what's happening in politics. And to put politics in some ways primary and then define how political science can help to inform it versus saying, here's an interesting academic research topic, how does it relate to what's happening in the real world?
Mm-hmm. You were mentioning that it was pretty different to actually come forward with this book. Does it generally become more difficult to write about populism the more there is out on populism? Or is it becoming easier because the phenomenon is just so much more over the place?
So any field, so you can think about some other fields, which is very interesting if you get in on the ground floor. I'm thinking of, for example, books which I did say, one of my best-selling books is The Digital Divide. And I did that in 2000, and it came out in 2001. And the internet was actually started in the form we know it in 1994 with the first visual browser. By the end of the 90s, it was a bubble, everything was moving up. And that book, which came out, which was just trying to look systematically, has been widely cited because it's one of the first. You can set out conceptual frameworks, you can set out ways that other people can then run with. Mm-hmm. My book on critical citizens had the same impact. That was about trusting government. That came out in 1999. And again, we had a simple way to reconfigure the framework for understanding system support. And lots of people found it useful. And then what they can do is they can say, does this work in India? Does it work in Indonesia? Does it work in Sweden or whatever? So there are great advantages in being at a cutting edge of new topics. I wrote a book on radical right about 10 years ago. That was of the old parties, etc. But I really wanted to totally change it for this book. And then with this book, it's a challenge because the evidence is still emerging, as much as the topics are emerging, as much as the research is emerging, but there's so much needs to be done. So I think this is a part of the explanation from our book, mm-hmm. but we need to go a lot further. Yeah. Lots of research to be done.
You mentioned your book on the internet, and Nuno actually asked a question on this matter. On your research about the internet, would you say Twitter, for example, vindicated those anonymous users who use the application to trend news and policy instead of just passively reading news the traditional way? What's your position on how internet changes policy making and power?
Oh, that's a big question. So I've always said from the very beginning that the internet is a tool, and Twitter is a tool, Facebook is a tool, what we're doing now is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad, and it can... people basically were always cyber optimists. They always thought this was going to transform politics or transform policy, transform education, you name it. And then came the pessimists and said, oh, no, it's all bad because all these minority groups are out there and they're organising and hate speech is out there and so on, which is true. But I mean, basically, you wouldn't say do newspapers or television, basically, or any other medium have a transformative capacity. Politics adapts to them. So politics certainly changes, campaigns change, just like the new technology will change various ways. The ways in which, for example, Twitter is used by Trump has transformed the role of the presidential communication, for good or bad, mostly for bad in my view, but that's something else. But technology is there as part of the broader society, as part of the broader politics. And some of the things that we hoped in the beginning of the internet age haven't really come about. There is some new engagement, clearly, but it's not actually absolutely transformed the way people are active or policymakers. And by the way, policymakers are some of the slowest to actually adapt to these things as well, because they're a certain generation and they don't think it's necessarily the critical way that they should be connecting with their constituents.
Mm-hmm. Coming to our end here, I would like to ask you about the future perspective, basically. So we are talking about the current development, about that we are right now on this very important point, and what is this point making with democracy in general. From what you are working on right now, how do you see populism developing in the future?
Well, I'm going to move a little bit. So my new research is going to be on the whole issue of democratic backlash and authoritarian resurgence. So I'm going to move a little bit towards the institutions rather than just populism as in parties or populism as in social movements. And I think there we've got real challenges. Basically, since the third wave era of Huntington, since the early 70s, we've always been trying to explain how societies transition from authoritarian regimes to less rigid, particularly through multi-party competition and elections, and then ultimately how they consolidate. So if the trends are very clearly going in the other way, basically since 2005, we need to revise all of our theories, and most of our theories don't work in reverse. So if you take cases like Hungary, why on earth are they going backwards in terms of human rights? It's clearly not things like economic development. They've been very successful. So the whole idea of Lipset, which is that the more affluent you are, the more educated you are, the more the society is becoming developed, the more they become democratic, doesn't work, nor does the threshold thesis about democracy either, because again they're above the threshold. And the same can be said of many other countries. And there are other explanations. For example, Levitsky and Voet say it's about linkage and leverage, how far a country is close to the West or away from the West. But again, that really doesn't work, especially if we're talking about a decline of democracy in the West. And we might want to think about reversing that to think about Russia and the ways in which they can destabilize Ukraine and some of their own neighboring states, including and also, of course, other countries like Germany, and the Brexit referendum, because they have leverage and linkage, but from an authoritarian perspective. And then you have other theories like, well, if we only had power-sharing constitutions, Leiphardt's theory, that should mean that we get strong democracies. But again, we can see that institutions and constitutions can be changed, and they can be changed to reinforce the power of the leader as much as anything else. And what we're faced with, therefore, is that a lot of our traditional literature on democratization, from lots of different perspectives, from the 70s and 80s, that seemed pretty good, doesn't seem to work right now. We really need to revise our theories and revise the way that we're thinking about some of these issues. So it's a big challenge, and hopefully we've got a good team that might be able to work on those issues.
Pippa Norris, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, for answer all my questions and all the questions from our audience. And thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Congress.
Thank you very much.